Welcome everybody. Welcome to the first of these conferences on language documentation and archiving to be held in Europe. We hope it's the first of regular conferences that we'll be running in Europe, jointly organised this time by PARADISEC and ELAR. It's wonderful to see the number of papers proposed and the range of topics discussed. We've now had the experience of archiving digital language materials in various forms for some 2 decades. And 2 archives, the Language Archive and ELAR, of course, were associated with funding programs. Others were developed to meet a particular need in a language area or a regional area. We've learned a great deal about using archives, and we've seen an increase in the way that researchers deposit, create collections, and cite their own materials in archives. At the same time, we see that other researchers are accessing and reusing language archive materials. Nevertheless, much remains to be done, and we need many more archives. We need to digitize more, and we need to train all of our new researchers. Before we begin the conference properly, we always, in Australia now, want to acknowledge and pay our respects to traditional owners of the lands we live and work on, and acknowledge that these are stolen lands, and the small amount of work that we do in recording and archiving language records, we hope is a part of reciprocation and returning material to people recorded. We know that archiving is a standard function now that all language documenters should be engaging with. But we know also that there are many researchers who don't archive their records, and there's still a lot to be done. And there's also a lot of analog tapes, manuscripts, and so on, yet to be found, digitized and archived. These are the tasks ahead of us. We know also that in the last 20 years, we've had the rise of archives, as I mentioned earlier, and the networking that's provided by the Digital Endangered Languages and Music Archives Network, DELAMAN, and the continued functioning of the Open Language Archives community. These are 2 services that are really quite important in bringing together the community. And of course, there were the 2 major funding programs that mandated archiving of documentation materials. A point that we need to keep making to our universities and other authorities is that data storage is not the same as a curated archive. So data storage gives you persistence, at least until the university changes its policies. It's inward facing, that is, you can only get access to that storage if you're in the university network, and it's typically single user. Whereas the archives that we're talking about have deposit conditions applied by the collection or the creator of the collection. And these access conditions are applied by the archive and allow people to have user management and to apply conditions for different users to access different items. We have an upload routine that checks file names and types to ensure consistency. Contents are regularly checked, and there are backups and disaster recovery provided by the archive, and the catalogue is publicly available with API feeds to other services. So all of this is something that language archives do that simple storage at our universities doesn't do. So we know that archiving has good research benefits. We can cite our primary data to support theoretical claims, and we can build on existing research rather than doing it all again. And at the end of every project, we know that the primary research records will be safely stored and available into the future. And this is true also for your own research. So it's not just accessing other people's research, but it's actually accessing your own research over time. We have a number of examples of people who've lost their own research materials on their laptops and are able to get them back from the archives. And of course, verifiability of claims is important. So being able to cite example sentences and have other people go and listen to the context of those sentences. But it's also ethically important to do this because we're creating records of cultural and human value that will have benefit to many other people beyond the research community we belong to, and especially to the people recorded and their descendants. And another ethical imperative is that there has been a heavy investment, usually by our government and taxpayer, in creating our research data, and it shouldn't be lost, and eventually it should be available to them as well. However, if we look at each language for which a linguist has done fieldwork, we can look at how much has been archived if we look into the ELAC statistics for archived material in ELAC repositories. So of course, material can be archived in other places, but in this particular study, we looked at just what was in ELAC repositories. So typically a language that has been worked on should have recordings, text, lexical files, and so on. However, if we look at the 1,857 grammars produced between 1967 and 2020, we would expect to have records available for all of those. But let's be generous and talk about the time after Himmelmann's article, when people were more aware of the issues. So if we look at just the period from 2000 till 2020, 832 grammars were written. Of those 832 languages, 661 have 40 or fewer items in an ELAC repository. And if we take off the total of 832, about 100 languages which were funded by DOBIS or ELDP, that means about 90% of the language work that was done is not reflected in primary records in archives. So there's still quite a way to go, even within our own community, and we need to be encouraging those people still to archive the material from that research. And then the prospects for the future, well, we need better ways of creating collections before going into the archive, and Lametta is a tool that ELAR, University of Hawaii, Manoa, and our Centre of Excellence funded to create well-formed metadata on your laptop so that you can then deposit that directly into the archive, and it exports into the various archives required formats. So building better tools to encourage people to create better long-term collections. We'd like to be able to play media in ELAR. So here's an example from the next version of the PARADISEC catalog, where you're able to play ELAR files together with the transcripts and the audio. So you can see there that having an ELAR file and an audio file or a video file in the same directory invokes a player, and that player allows you then to view the transcript together with the media, and in this system also search the transcripts. So you're then able to resolve to a single utterance. So these are the kinds of developments, I think, that are quite exciting and make the data inside the archive more accessible. The other exciting development is the possibility of automatic transcription of untranscribed media. And there's a lot of effort, as you can see, a number of papers there coming out of different parts of the world where people are experimenting with mouse and Kaldi and new technologies for automated recognition of speech so that it can be rendered as text. And some of this can be done with very small training sets, unlike the early days. So now with just a few hours of training, you're able to get transcriptions. So there's a lot of possibility there for making especially legacy audio recordings more accessible. There's also an important aspect of what we do in returning materials to the communities they come from. At PARADISEC, we've been experimenting with using Raspberry Pi Wi-Fi transmitters and putting portions of the collection onto the Raspberry Pi and having it available in local communities where people can access it on their mobile phones, cell phones, rather than on hard disks and on computers. And I think there's a lot of possibility for this kind of return of materials as well. As I mentioned earlier, that there are many recordings still out there that need to be found, and we need to arrange funding so that we can digitize them. We run this Lost and Found survey through Delaman and periodically discover new collections. One that we worked on recently were 300 recordings from the Solomon Islands sitting in the home of the retired academic. And we got funding from ELDP actually to do that work. But there's much more to be done there too. All of this ends up with what we call dialogic archiving, a term that Nick Evans coined at our conference earlier last year, in which the contents of the archive go out to people who know about those contents. They can annotate them, they can use them to revitalize knowledge, and then they can put new interpretations and annotations back into the archive. And so we have this very good feedback loop. If the material is archived, if it's discoverable, if it's accessible, then all of this becomes possible. And ultimately, this allows us to provide materials to support revitalization of forgotten practices like language and song. As we'll hear from the presentations over the next few days, there's a necessary effort in our academic fields to ensure that records we make are accessible into the future, primarily so that people record can access them and reuse them, often in ways we haven't foreseen. I want to thank all the staff at ELAR and PARADISEC who have organised this conference and negotiated the various time zones and time differences to provide us with a rich offering of presentations over the next few days. I hope that everybody's able to figure out when to turn up, and we will be recording most of the sessions so that you'll be able to see them even if they're presented while you're asleep. So thanks very much, and I think you can have a break now until we start in about 15 minutes time. Thanks.